So that's the way I kind of cast this issue, is that there's no sense that the prophet started something by launching an offensive. War had already started. War was going before he was even born. That constant state of competition and war predated the prophet, peace be upon him, and existed throughout his life. And so the things that he did to succeed and flourish within that are eminently justifiable based on that logic. So I don't feel any kind of sense of embarrassment about that. As a historian of war and strategy, and someone who studied warfare from the ancient world to the present day, I knew that war exists in every century and in every civilization and in every culture, and that it has an enormous role within all of them, or it has had, and that it's had an almost unique ability to transform societies. So that part of it wasn't so hard for me to deal with. I also knew that throughout history, change comes through success in war, and success comes through offensive operations. The defense, sitting on the defense, allows survival, but not change. You will survive if you are besieged or attacked, and you win in that contest. But nothing has changed. To change, you have to take the fight to the enemy and impose your will upon the enemy. And that's as true today as it has been for 6,000 years of recorded history, 5,000 years. And so that side of it, I didn't struggle with so much as the issue of my religious bias. As I said, I am a believing Muslim. Quran is my book, and Muhammad, peace be upon him, is my prophet. And so I found it a desire to go along with the standard narrative quite difficult to resist. And I had to kind of force myself to do that, to say, look, I've got to step back and treat his life as if I'm reading about the campaigns of Napoleon or Frederick the Great or Gustavus Adolphus or General Eisenhower or General Rommel. I've got to look at him, the man that I esteem and love, and try to emulate with the same spirit of objectivity as I would approach the campaigns of Napoleon. That's not easy. No. And it took me a while. So where does that leave me? I mentioned earlier that the defense in war leads to status quo for your side if you're on the defense. If you're successful, you achieve your survival. That's it. To change society, to change those things around you that you need to change, you have to go on the offense. It's the offense that brings change and transformation. And God gave our prophet, peace be upon him, a very powerful mission, which was to transform that part of Arabia into a strict monotheism and a cohesive group of believers at a time when there were 50 or 60 tribes who were already at constant warfare. Now, it's hard for us to imagine that, and I tell you why, because in today's world, the default setting is peace. And the aberration is what we see happening in Ukraine. We see a nasty war that's claimed 100,000 lives already in a year. That's the aberration against the world order. And the world is characterized by peace. Now, where did that come from? Where did it come from, the belief that the world default setting is peace? The answer is, I think, it comes from the Second World War, from Nuremberg. The Germans attacked Poland in 1939 and then Russia in 1941. And after the Second World War, the Russians insisted that the major war criminals, as they were accused of being, were responsible for unwarranted aggression. and that they had to pay for that. So at Nuremberg, they created 4 charges that they leveled against the leading Nazis: conspiracy, crimes against peace, crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So let's look at crimes against peace. It's based on an idea that peace is the default setting of human, of nations. Crimes, war crimes means crimes done by groups of soldiers against other groups of soldiers. Crimes against humanity means primarily crimes done against non-combatants and civilians. But the one that fascinates me is crimes against peace. How do they define that at Nuremberg? They said that it's an act of aggression on a large scale using military force. That it's waging what they called an unprovoked war, or a war without a just cause. And in Nuremberg, they had a phrase that said that aggression, this is their definition, is the supreme international crime because it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Now, that's a piece of legal jargon to say that offensive war isn't necessarily wrong in itself, but if it's offensive war for an unwarranted reason, without a just cause, it qualifies as aggression. And if it qualifies as aggression, it forms what's called a crime against the peace. So it seems to me that this is where this kind of codification of this idea that the state of the world is peace.
Such a concept never existed before this time, so this wouldn't have never factored into the mindset of 7th century Arabian society.
Or 19th century British fighting Napoleon, or Napoleon fighting the British or the Prussians or the Russians, or Gustavus Adolphus or Friedrich the Great, or the indigenous American tribes fighting each other, or African peoples fighting it. I mean, wars always existed, and war offensively wasn't always wrong. And in fact, often it was glorious. And by that I mean it was esteemed by the people doing it. I'm not saying that I think it's glorious, personally, myself, today. The United Nations Charter, which came out even before the war in Japan was over, said this, Article 2, Section 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So that's the phrase that tries to dissuade states from going to war against each other. And again, it's based on this notion that aggression is defined by an act of war for which there's no provocation or no just cause. Now, within a war, let's say it's the Second World War, and it starts 1939 and it's going to 1945. So let's take 1942 and 1943. And the British and the Americans launched an offensive in Italy as part of their contribution to their aim of defeating the Germans. That's an offensive war. It's an offensive operation within an existing war. And we did an awful lot of that. If you take D-Day, 10,000 soldiers died on the 6th of June, 1944. That's an offensive operation. But in an existing war for which there's a just cause for that operation. So let's go back to the 7th century. There's 50 or 60 major tribes in Arabia, all squabbling, all fighting, all competing continuously. And within that state of war, you already have enemies all around you. They are enemies already. So if you raid them, for example, you're not creating a new enemy or conducting an act of aggression against a people that without a provocation. The state of war already exists. It was essentially the default setting in the rather lawless part of the world at a time when there weren't states, but competing tribal groups, all of which saw themselves as unique in themselves and a competitor to all those around them. And so that's the way I kind of cast this issue, is that there's no sense that the Prophet started something by launching an offensive. War had already started. War was going before he was even born. That constant state of competition and war predated the Prophet, peace be upon him, and existed throughout his life. And so the things that he did to succeed and flourish within that are eminently justifiable based on that logic. So I don't feel any kind of sense of embarrassment about that.